The unexpected encounter. Ethan had always loved the mountains. The peace, the quiet, the endless sky above. It was his sanctuary. After years of living in the bustling city, he had finally left it all behind to settle in a small, self-built cabin deep in the woods. He didn't mind the isolation. In fact, he welcomed it. The forest, with its towering trees and winding trails, was his home now. But today, as he trudged up the familiar path with his backpack full of supplies, something felt off. When he reached the clearing where his cabin stood, Ethan stopped in his tracks. The door, which he always made sure to lock before leaving, was slightly open. A faint breeze carried the scent of wood and pine, but something else lingered in the air, something unfamiliar. His pulse quickened as he stepped closer. Maybe it's just the wind, he muttered to himself, though his gut told him otherwise. Cautiously, Ethan pushed the door open. His cabin, which he had left neat and tidy, looked different. The firewood pile near the hearth was disturbed, and a blanket from his bed had been dragged across the floor. On the small wooden table, his fruit basket was empty, save for a single apple with a bite taken out of it. He frowned. Someone had been here. His first thought was a hiker lost in the woods. It wasn't unheard of, though his cabin was far from any marked trail. But the bite marks on the apple were odd, too small and precise for a human. As he scanned the room, his eyes landed on the corner near the firewood stack. There, half hidden in the shadows, he saw something that made his breath catch. A pair of eyes, large and glowing faintly, stared back at him. Ethan froze. "Hello," he said softly, his voice calm despite the hammering of his heart. "I'm not going to hurt you." The eyes blinked, and for a moment there was silence. Then, before Ethan could take a step closer, the figure bolted. It moved so fast that he barely registered what he was seeing. A flash of silvery blue skin, slender limbs, and a trail of strange, shimmering dust. Whoever, or whatever, it was darted past him and out the door, disappearing into the trees. Ethan stood there, stunned. His mind raced to make sense of what he had just seen. The figure wasn't human. He was sure of that. Its movements were too quick, too fluid. And that skin, it almost seemed to glow in the dim light. For a moment, he debated whether to follow. But the creature was long gone, and chasing it into the dense forest at dusk didn't seem wise. Instead, he walked back inside, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions. Who was she? Why had she been here? And what was she hiding from? As Ethan inspected the cabin, he noticed more signs of her presence. The makeshift bed near the firewood wasn't his doing, and there were faint footprints in the dust, small, delicate prints that led to the door and out into the woods. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She had been hiding, probably terrified, and he had scared her away. That night, Ethan sat by the fire, unable to shake the image of her glowing eyes. He thought about her small frame, her quick movements, and the strange shimmering dust that seemed to follow her. He had never seen anything like it, not in all his years of hiking and exploring. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Ethan made a decision. If she came back, he wouldn't frighten her. He would leave food out, something to show he meant no harm. Whoever, or whatever, she was, she didn't seem dangerous. If anything, she seemed scared and vulnerable. The next morning, Ethan set out a plate of food on the porch, a couple of apples, some bread, and a canteen of water. Then he retreated into the cabin, leaving the door slightly ajar. He spent the day pretending to busy himself with chores, all the while keeping an eye on the porch. Hours passed, and the food remained untouched. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan began to wonder if she would ever return. But just as he was about to give up, he saw a flicker of movement in the trees. She was back. Ethan held his breath as she crept closer, her steps light and cautious. Her glowing eyes darted around, scanning for danger. When she reached the porch, she hesitated, her gaze fixed on the plate of food. Slowly, she reached out, her slender fingers trembling as she picked up an apple. Ethan didn't move. He stayed by the window, watching in silence. She took a bite of the apple, her expression softening as she chewed. For a moment, she looked almost human. Then, as if sensing his gaze, she turned her head. Their eyes met through the glass, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved. But before Ethan could say or do anything, she bolted once again, disappearing into the forest like a shadow. This time, Ethan wasn't afraid. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. She would be back, and when she came, he would be ready to show her that she had nothing to fear. The Silent Watcher. Ethan spent the next few days feeling like he wasn't alone. The mountain cabin, once his sanctuary of solitude, now felt like it had a hidden presence. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of wood, set his senses on edge. It wasn't fear, it was curiosity. He was certain she was still out there, watching. The food he left out on the porch would mysteriously disappear each morning. At first, he thought it might be wildlife, but then he noticed something strange. The bread and apples were taken, but the canteen of water remained untouched, almost as if she didn't trust it. Then there were the faint footprints in the dirt, too small for a bear or any animal he could think of. One night, while sitting by the fire, Ethan heard it, a soft thud outside the cabin. It wasn't the sound of an animal rummaging or a branch falling. It was deliberate, like a cautious step. He stood, moving quietly to the window, and peered out. In the moonlight, he saw her. She was crouched near the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a tree. Her silvery blue skin shimmered faintly, and her glowing eyes scanned the area, wary of any danger. She seemed smaller now, more fragile, as if the weight of the world rested on her slender shoulders. Ethan stepped away from the window, not wanting to startle her. Instead, he grabbed a blanket and the plate of food he had prepared earlier. He opened the door, placed the items on the porch, and stepped back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. He waited, his heart racing. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, until he heard the faintest sound of movement. Through the crack in the door, he saw her approach. She moved with an almost ghost-like grace, her steps so light they barely disturbed the dirt. When she reached the porch, she hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the open door. Ethan held his breath, resisting the urge to step outside. He wanted to earn her trust, not scare her away again. Slowly, she reached for the blanket, running her fingers over its soft fabric. Then she picked up an apple, sniffed it cautiously, and took a small bite. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if the simple act of eating offered some comfort. But then something changed. Her head snapped up, her glowing eyes fixed on the door. Ethan realized she must have heard his heartbeat or sensed his presence. She stood frozen for a moment, clutching the blanket tightly, before retreating into the woods with the food. This time, Ethan didn't feel disappointment. She had taken the blanket, which meant she was beginning to trust him, even if only a little. It was a small victory, but it gave him hope. The next day, Ethan decided to leave the cabin and explore the surrounding forest. He wasn't looking for her, not directly, but he wanted to understand where she might be hiding. The woods were dense, filled with towering pines and rocky outcroppings, perfect for someone who didn't want to be found. As he walked, he began noticing subtle signs, a small pile of stones near a stream, arranged in a way that seemed intentional, a patch of moss disturbed, revealing the faint outline of her footprints. She was close. He could feel it. By midday, Ethan stumbled upon something unexpected. Nestled between two large boulders was a makeshift shelter, crafted from branches and covered with a layer of leaves. It wasn't much, but it was enough to shield someone from the elements. Inside, he saw remnants of her presence, a piece of cloth torn from her clothing, a half-eaten piece of fruit, and a strange metallic object that didn't look like it belonged on Earth. Ethan picked up the object, turning it over in his hands. It was smooth and cold, with intricate patterns etched into its surface. He had no idea what it was, but it confirmed what he already suspected. She wasn't from this world. Carefully, he placed the object back where he found it and left the shelter, making sure not to disturb anything else. He didn't want to give her a reason to mistrust him. As he made his way back to the cabin, he couldn't help but wonder about her story. Where had she come from? How had she ended up here, alone and afraid? That night, Ethan left another offering on the porch, a larger meal this time, along with a handwritten note. The note was simple: "You're safe here. I just want to help." He wasn't sure if she could read English, but he hoped she would understand the gesture. Hours passed, and just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he heard it again. That soft, deliberate sound outside. He stayed in bed, listening intently. After a few moments, he heard the faint creak of the porch and the rustle of movement. The next morning, the food was gone, and so was the note, but in its place was something unexpected. A small, glowing crystal, unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It shimmered with a soft light, casting faint patterns on the wooden planks of the porch. Ethan held the crystal in his hand, marveling at its beauty. It was a gift, he realized, a token of trust, perhaps even gratitude. A smile spread across his face as he turned it over, watching the light dance within. She was trying to communicate, to bridge the gap between them. For the first time, Ethan felt a spark of connection. She wasn't just a mystery or a fleeting presence in the woods. She was someone who needed help, someone who had chosen to trust him, even if just a little, and he was determined not to let her down. The fragile trust. Ethan woke early the next morning, the glowing crystal from the night before still sitting on his wooden table. Its faint light seemed to pulse softly, as if alive. He turned it over in his hands, studying the intricate patterns etched into its surface. It felt warm, almost as if it were responding to his touch. The crystal wasn't just a gift, it was a message, though he couldn't begin to understand its meaning. Outside, the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of pine. Ethan stepped onto the porch and looked toward the tree line where he had last seen her. Was she out there now, watching him? Did she feel the same cautious curiosity that he did? Determined to show her she could trust him, Ethan spent the morning preparing. He packed a small bag with food, water, and medical supplies. The last part was a gamble. He didn't know if she was hurt, but he had noticed the way she moved, carefully, as if nursing an injury. The thought of her being in pain made his chest tighten. He didn't want her to feel alone in whatever she was going through. That afternoon, Ethan set out, following the subtle trail she had left behind. Her movements were clever, designed to mask her presence, but he had spent years learning the ways of the forest. He could see the faint disturbances in the earth, the occasional broken twig, and the shimmering specks of dust she seemed to leave behind. The trail led him deeper into the woods than he had ever ventured. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft, golden beams. He felt a strange sense of reverence, as if he were walking into a sacred space. Finally, he found her. She was sitting by a stream, her back to him. Her silvery blue skin seemed to glow in the sunlight, and her hair, dark and flowing, cascaded over her shoulders. She was washing something in the water, a piece of fabric, perhaps part of her clothing. Her movements were slow and deliberate, almost ritualistic. Ethan didn't want to startle her, so he cleared his throat softly. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "It's just me." She froze, her hands gripping the fabric tightly. Slowly, she turned her head, her glowing eyes locking onto his. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Then she stood, backing away slightly, her body tense and ready to flee. Ethan raised his hands, showing her the bag he carried. "I brought food," he said, kneeling to place the bag on the ground. "And medicine. I thought, maybe you might need it." She didn't move, her eyes flicking between him and the bag. Ethan took a step back, giving her space. "I'm not here to hurt you," he added. "I just want to help." Her gaze softened slightly, but she didn't approach. Instead, she tilted her head, studying him as if trying to decipher his intentions. Then, slowly, she raised a hand and pointed to the bag. Ethan nodded. "It's yours," he said. "Take whatever you need." She stepped closer, her movements cautious but deliberate. When she reached the bag, she knelt and opened it, her slender fingers exploring its contents. She pulled out an apple, turning it over in her hands, and then a small medical kit. She paused, her glowing eyes meeting his as if to ask for permission. Ethan smiled. "Go ahead. It's all for you." Her expression softened further, and for the first time, Ethan saw a hint of something he hadn't expected: gratitude. She took the medical kit and set it aside, then opened it and examined the bandages and ointments inside. That's when he noticed it, a long, deep cut running along her forearm. The wound was faintly glowing, and strange, almost vein-like patterns extended from it, pulsing softly. Ethan's heart sank. "That looks bad," he said, gesturing to her arm. Can I help you with that?" She hesitated, her body tensing again. For a moment, Ethan thought she might run, but then she gave a small nod, holding out her arm. Carefully, Ethan knelt beside her. Up close, her skin was even more alien than he had imagined, smooth, almost metallic, and cool to the touch. The glowing veins around the wound seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, a faint hum emanating from them. He cleaned the cut as gently as he could, applying an antiseptic ointment and wrapping it with a bandage. She watched him closely the entire time, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she flexed her fingers, testing the bandage. Then she looked at him again and did something that surprised him. She smiled. It was small and tentative, but it was there. "You're welcome," Ethan said, smiling back. He sat back on his heels, giving her space. "I don't know if you can understand me, but I'm glad you're letting me help." She tilted her head again, as if considering his words. Then, to his astonishment, she spoke. Her voice was soft and melodic, her words a mix of sounds he didn't recognize and something close to English. "Thank you." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "You can talk." She nodded slowly, her glowing eyes studying his reaction. "Learn. Little," she said, her voice halting but clear. "Your language." Ethan felt a rush of emotion, excitement, curiosity, and a strange sense of connection. She wasn't just some strange being hiding in the woods. She was someone who was trying to bridge the gap between them. "I'll teach you more," he said, his voice steady. "If you want." She hesitated, then nodded again. For the first time, Ethan felt like they weren't just two strangers in the forest. They were beginning to understand each other, piece by piece. And in that moment, he knew this was only the beginning of their story, the revealed truth. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about their last encounter. The alien woman, Caria, as she had introduced herself in halting English, was not just some lost, frightened creature. She was intelligent, cautious, and, above all, trying to survive in a world that wasn't hers. The thought weighed on him as he prepared supplies for their next meeting. He wasn't sure how much she'd trust him, but he was determined to try. A week later, Caria appeared at his cabin again. This time, she didn't wait until nightfall. As the sun cast golden light over the clearing, Ethan heard a soft knock on the door. When he opened it, there she was, standing on his porch with the same cautious look in her glowing eyes. She had wrapped the blanket he had given her around her shoulders, and in her hands she clutched the small glowing crystal she had gifted him earlier. "You came back," Ethan said, smiling. He stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. "Come in. It's safer here." Caria hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside. She moved gracefully, her silvery blue skin shimmering faintly in the dim light. She glanced around the cabin, her eyes lingering on the firewood stack, the table, and the tools hanging on the wall, as if committing every detail to memory. Then she turned to him. "Help," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Need help?" Ethan nodded. "Of course, anything you need." Carria motioned for him to follow her, and together they walked into the woods. She led him deep into the forest, farther than he had ever gone before. The trees grew denser, their towering branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of wildlife faded into an eerie stillness. Finally, they reached a hidden clearing. In the center stood a large metallic structure, partially buried in the earth. It was her ship. Ethan stared in awe, his heart racing. The ship was unlike anything he had ever seen, sleek and alien, with smooth curves and strange, glowing symbols etched into its surface. A faint hum emanated from it, a low vibration that seemed to resonate in his chest. "This is yours?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with wonder. Carria nodded. "Ship, broken. Crash. Here." Ethan stepped closer, running his fingers along the cool, metallic surface. The material felt unlike any metal he had ever encountered, light yet strong, almost alive. He turned to Carria. "Can you fix it?" She shook her head, her expression filled with frustration. "Need. Part. Missing." Ethan frowned. "What kind of part?" She hesitated, then pointed to a small opening near the ship's base. Inside was a complex array of machinery, wires, and glowing crystals, many of which were cracked or missing. She reached into the opening and removed a shard of one of the crystals, holding it out to him. "Power core," she said. "Broken." Ethan examined the shard, its edges smooth and its interior glowing faintly. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, but he could tell it was important. Without it, her ship wouldn't fly, and she would remain stranded. As they sat by the ship, Carria began to explain, her words slow and deliberate as she pieced together her limited English. She told him how she had been sent on a reconnaissance mission to explore planets on the edge of her star system. Earth had not been her intended destination, but a malfunction in her navigation system had sent her ship hurtling through space. She had crash-landed in the mountains weeks ago, unable to repair her ship or communicate with her people. Ethan listened intently, his mind racing with questions. "What happens if you can't fix it? Will your people come for you?" Carria shook her head, her expression somber. "No. Alone." The weight of her words hit him. She wasn't just stranded. She was completely cut off, with no way to call for help. Ethan's heart ached for her. He couldn't imagine the loneliness she must have felt, hiding in the woods, unsure if she could trust anyone. "We'll figure something out," he said, his voice firm. "You're not alone anymore." Carria looked at him, her glowing eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before. Hope. She nodded, a small but genuine smile playing on her lips. Over the next few days, Ethan worked tirelessly to help her. Using the tools and materials he had at the cabin, he repaired what he could of the ship's exterior. Carria guided him, her movements precise and deliberate as she explained the alien technology. Though her English was limited, they found ways to communicate, through gestures, drawings, and the occasional shared laugh when something went wrong. One evening, as they worked side by side, Ethan asked, "What's your home like?" Carria paused, her eyes distant as she thought of her distant world. "Bright," she said. "Sky. Many colors. Water. Shines like crystal. People. Like me." Ethan smiled. "It sounds beautiful." She nodded, but her expression turned somber. "Miss it?" Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll get you back there. I promise." As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger. Carria began to open up, sharing more about her world and her people. Ethan found himself fascinated by her stories, but he also couldn't help but notice the sadness that lingered in her voice. She was a traveler, a scientist, an explorer, and now, a stranger in a strange land, longing for home. One night, as they sat by the fire, Carria handed Ethan the glowing crystal she had given him before. Key, she said. Ship needs power. Ethan frowned. This is the key to your ship. She nodded. But not enough. Need more. Ethan studied the crystal, its faint light reflecting in his eyes. He didn't know where to find more crystals like this, but he was determined to try. For the first time, he felt like he had a purpose beyond his quiet life in the mountains, a chance to help someone who truly needed him. Then we'll find them, he said, his voice resolute, no matter what it takes. Karia's eyes met his, and for the first time, Ethan saw something he hadn't expected. Trust. She wasn't just a stranded alien anymore. She was his friend, and he wasn't going to let her down. The growing bond. The days passed quickly, filled with a mix of hard work and quiet moments of understanding between Ethan and Karia. Their bond deepened as they spent more time together, piecing together the puzzle of her ship and her survival. Despite the language barrier, they had developed a rhythm, a silent dance of trust and cooperation. Ethan found himself looking forward to their shared moments, whether it was scavenging for materials in the forest or sitting by the fire as Karia tried to teach him a few words from her language. Her voice, melodic and soft, carried the weight of someone who had seen and endured much, yet there was also a childlike curiosity in her glowing eyes whenever she encountered something new on Earth. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ethan decided to show Karia something special. "Come with me," he said, motioning for her to follow. Karia tilted her head in curiosity but didn't hesitate. She had grown comfortable around him, her once cautious demeanor now replaced with quiet confidence. Ethan led her to a small clearing near the edge of a cliff. From there, the entire valley stretched out below, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The forest seemed to glow, and in the distance, a river shimmered like liquid silver. Karia gasped softly, her eyes widening in awe. She stepped forward, her silvery blue skin catching the last rays of sunlight, making her seem like a part of the landscape itself. "It's beautiful," she said in her halting English, the words carrying a mix of wonder and sadness. Ethan smiled. "I thought you might like it. Sometimes, when things feel overwhelming, I come here. It reminds me how small my problems are compared to the world." Karia turned to him, her expression soft. "Your world, peaceful." He hesitated, thinking about her words. "It can be, but it's not always. People, we don't always get along. There's war, destruction, greed, but there's also kindness, love, and hope. I guess it's a mix, like any place." She nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. "Same, my world." As the sky darkened, the stars began to emerge, one by one, until the entire expanse above them was a canvas of glittering light. Ethan noticed Karia's eyes brighten, reflecting the starlight. She looked up, her expression a mix of longing and something deeper. "My stars," she whispered, pointing to a faint cluster in the sky. "Home. There." Ethan followed her gaze. "That's where you're from." She nodded. "Far. Very far." He studied her face, noticing the way her jaw tightened and her shoulders slumped. She missed her home, her family, her people. And yet, she was here, stranded and unsure if she would ever return. "You'll get back there," Ethan said softly. "We'll find a way." She looked at him, her glowing eyes searching his face for something. Trust, assurance, whatever it was, she seemed to find it, because she smiled, a small, fragile smile that carried the weight of her hope. Back at the cabin, their work continued. Ethan had scored every inch of the forest for materials that might help repair Karia's ship, but progress was slow. One evening, Karia brought him a strange metallic device she had salvaged from her ship. It was small, about the size of a grapefruit, and pulsed faintly with blue light. "What is it?" Ethan asked, turning it over in his hands. "Translator," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Fix, help talk." Ethan's brows lifted. You can fix this." She nodded, her slender fingers already working to open the device. Over the next few hours, Ethan watched in awe as she tinkered with the translator, using tools she had crafted from parts of her ship and scavenged materials. Her focus was intense, her movements precise, and for the first time, Ethan got a glimpse of her true capabilities. Finally, she held up the device, her face glowing with triumph. Done. When she activated it, the device emitted a soft hum, and a few seconds later, her voice came through. Not in her own language, but in perfect, fluid English. "Ethan," she said, her voice clear and steady, though still carrying a faint melodic quality. "Can you hear me?" His jaw dropped. "Carria, that's amazing. I can understand you perfectly." She smiled, a genuine, wide smile that lit up her face. "Now we can talk. Truly talk." Over the next few days, their conversations deepened. Carria told him about her home, a planet with skies that shimmered like opals and oceans that glowed under twin moons. She spoke of her people, a proud and curious race of explorers who valued knowledge above all else. She told him of her mission, meant to study the edge of her star system, and the accident that had brought her to Earth. In turn, Ethan shared stories of his life, his struggles in the city, his decision to leave it all behind, and his love for the mountains. He told her about Earth's beauty and its flaws, its wonders and its dangers. Through their conversations, they found a deep understanding of each other. Despite their differences, they shared the same fears, hopes, and desires. They were two souls, lost in their own ways, who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. One night, as they sat by the fire, Carria looked at Ethan with a seriousness that caught him off guard. "You are kind," she said, "more than I expected. Humans, I thought you were dangerous. But you, different." Ethan chuckled. "I guess we're all full of surprises. You're not what I expected, either." Carria's smile faded slightly, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "You risk much, helping me." He shrugged. "It's worth it." She leaned closer, her glowing eyes fixed on his. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." For a moment, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, and the firelight dancing between them. In that quiet moment, Ethan realized something. Carria wasn't just a visitor from another world. She was someone he cared about deeply, and he would do whatever it took to help her find her way home. The threat. Ethan had grown used to the rhythm of his days with Carria. Their fragile partnership had blossomed into a bond of mutual trust and understanding. Each morning, they worked on repairing her ship, and each evening, they shared stories under the stars. But this calm, fragile world they had built was about to be shattered. One evening, as Ethan returned from gathering materials near the river, he felt a strange unease. The forest was too quiet, the usual symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves replaced by an eerie stillness. His senses sharpened as he hurried back to the cabin, his mind racing with thoughts of Carria. Was she safe? Had something happened while he was away? As he approached the clearing, he spotted her standing outside the cabin, her silvery blue skin glinting faintly in the fading light. She was motionless, her head tilted toward the sky. Following her gaze, Ethan froze. A sleek black drone hovered above the trees, its polished surface reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. It made no sound, but its presence was unmistakably ominous. The device seemed to scan the area, its red lights sweeping across the clearing. "Carria," Ethan whispered urgently, dropping his bag and rushing toward her. "Get inside now." She didn't move, her glowing eyes locked on the drone. "They found me," she said softly, her voice tinged with fear. Ethan grabbed her arm gently but firmly, pulling her toward the cabin. "Who found you? What is that thing?" "Your people," she replied, her voice trembling. "They search for me." Ethan's stomach dropped. It made sense. Something as advanced as her ship would have drawn attention. But how had they found this remote location? He didn't have time to dwell on it. "We have to hide," he said, ushering her inside and shutting the door. Inside the cabin, Carria paced anxiously, her movements quick and fluid. Ethan could see the panic in her glowing eyes, the way her hands trembled as she clenched and unclenched them. He placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her. "Hey," he said softly, "we'll figure this out. I won't let them take you." Carria stopped and looked at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and despair. "They come, not to talk. They take. They hurt." Ethan felt a surge of anger. He didn't know who they were, government agents, scientists, or something worse. But the thought of anyone harming Carria made his blood boil. She was vulnerable, stranded and scared. He had to protect her. Suddenly, the drone outside emitted a high-pitched whine, followed by a burst of light. Ethan peeked through the window and saw it scanning the cabin, its red beams flickering over the walls and roof. He cursed under his breath. "They're scanning for life signs," he said. "We can't stay here." Carria nodded, her glowing eyes meeting his. "Ship, hide." Ethan hesitated. "Your ship. Won't they find it?" "Not yet. Shield. Active." He nodded. "Okay, let's go." The two of them slipped out the back door, moving quickly and quietly through the forest. Ethan's heart pounded as he led Carria along the narrow trails, his ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The forest felt alive with tension, every shadow and rustling branch a potential threat. They reached the hidden clearing where Carria's ship rested, partially buried in the earth. As they approached, the ship emitted a faint hum, its surface shimmering with a translucent shield. Carria placed her hand on the hull, and the shield rippled before dissolving, allowing them entry. Inside, the ship's interior was dimly lit, its walls lined with consoles and panels covered in glowing alien symbols. Ethan had been inside once before, but the advanced technology still left him in awe. Carria moved quickly, her hands flying over the controls. "Shield, stronger here," she said. "They not find." Ethan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a temporary solution. "How long can we stay hidden?" She paused, her glowing fingers hovering over a console. "Not long. Need. Fix power core." Ethan clenched his fists. They were running out of time, and he had no idea how to find the materials they needed. But he couldn't let Carria down. He wouldn't. Hours passed, and the tension in the ship was palpable. Ethan sat near the entrance, keeping watch, while Carria worked tirelessly on the ship's systems. Occasionally, she would glance at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "Ethan." He turned to her. "Yeah. Thank you." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "For staying. For helping." He smiled, though the weight of their situation pressed heavily on his chest. "I made a promise, didn't I?" She nodded, her glowing eyes meeting his. "You? Different. Kind." Ethan's smile faded slightly. "Not everyone on Earth is kind, Carria. If they find you." "They won't," she interrupted, her voice suddenly firm. "You. Protect me." He stared at her, surprised by the confidence in her words. She believed in him, even when he doubted himself. That belief ignited something within him, a determination to see this through, no matter the cost. As dawn approached, the faint hum of drones grew louder. Ethan and Carria exchanged a tense look. Their time was running out. But as the first rays of sunlight broke through the canopy, Ethan felt a surge of resolve. They would fight. They would survive. Together. And he would do whatever it took to keep Carria safe, even if it meant facing the unknown forces that hunted her. The emotional farewell. The forest was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that carried the weight of impending danger. The faint hum of drones had faded, but Ethan and Carria knew it wouldn't last. They were running out of time. The government, or whoever was searching, wouldn't stop until they found her. Inside the ship, Carria worked frantically at the control panel. Her silvery blue hands moved with precision as she calibrated the systems and rerouted power to compensate for the broken core. The glowing alien symbols on the screen reflected in her eyes, which were filled with determination and fear. Ethan stood nearby, his fists clenched. He hated feeling powerless, but he knew this was beyond anything he could control. All he could do was help her survive, and that meant helping her leave. "How much longer?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. Carria glanced at him, her expression grim. "Soon. Ship, ready to fly. But not far." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean, not far? Can't it take you home?" She hesitated, her glowing eyes meeting his. "Core, broken. No long travel. Need safe place. Close." The weight of her words hit him. She couldn't leave Earth. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He had hoped she could return to her world, to her people, but now it seemed that hope was slipping away. The cabin's defenses wouldn't hold for much longer. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, the hum of drones returned, louder and closer than before. Ethan's chest tightened as he peeked outside the ship. He could see faint red lights flickering in the distance, moving steadily toward them. "They're coming," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We have to move now." Carria nodded, her hands flying over the controls. Almost ready. Just one moment. Ethan stepped outside, scanning the forest for any signs of the search team. He spotted movement, a group of figures in black uniforms, carrying advanced equipment that glinted in the morning light. His heart pounded. They were closing in fast. "Carria," he shouted, running back inside. "We don't have time. They're here." Carria stood from the console, her face set with determination. "Ship can launch. But you." Ethan blinked, confused. "What about me?" "You stay. They hurt you." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. She was willing to leave him behind to protect him. But the thought of letting her go, of watching her face this danger alone, was unbearable. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not staying. If they catch me, they'll catch you too. We're in this together." Carria shook her head, her glowing eyes filled with a mix of fear and sorrow. "No, Ethan. This, my fight. You, not part of it." Ethan stepped closer, his voice steady. "I am now. You're not doing this alone." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their situation hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Carria nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The ship's engines roared to life, a deep hum that resonated through the ground. The translucent shield surrounding the ship shimmered and expanded, creating a temporary barrier that would buy them precious seconds. Carria motioned for Ethan to follow her as she strapped into the pilot's seat, her fingers dancing over the controls. "Hold on," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Ethan barely had time to strap himself into the co-pilot's chair before the ship lifted off the ground. The forest blurred beneath them as the ship rose higher, its engines emitting a soft glow that left trails of shimmering light. Ethan glanced out the window and saw the black uniformed figures scattering below, their weapons useless against the ship's shields. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. They had escaped. But the relief was short-lived. As the ship soared above the treetops, Carria's hands moved rapidly over the controls. Warning lights flashed on the console, and the hum of the engines grew uneven. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with concern. "Core, unstable," Carria replied, her glowing eyes focused on the screen. "Ship, not hold." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What do we do?" Carria hesitated, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to him, her voice calm but firm. "Ethan, you must leave." "What?" he asked, his heart racing. "No, I'm not leaving you." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch both gentle and urgent. "Ship, crash if you stay. You, safe on ground." Ethan shook his head. No, I'm not leaving you to face this alone. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw tears glistening in them. You save me. Now, I save you. The ship descended rapidly, the treetops rushing toward them. Carria guided it toward a clearing, her movements precise despite the chaos around her. At the last moment, she activated the emergency hatch and pushed Ethan toward it. Go, she shouted, her voice breaking. Please. Ethan hesitated, his heart torn, but the look in her eyes, pleading, desperate, made him move. He grabbed the emergency harness and leaped out of the ship just as it skimmed the ground, rolling to safety as it crashed in a brilliant burst of light. When Ethan scrambled to his feet, the clearing was a mess of smoke and debris. His heart pounded as he ran toward the wreckage, calling her name. Carria. He found her near the edge of the clearing, slumped against a piece of the ship's hull. She was alive but weak, her silvery blue skin dimmer than before. Ethan knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he cradled her. Carria, he whispered, you're okay. She smiled faintly, her glowing eyes meeting his. Safe, she said. You? Safe. Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he held her. I promised I'd protect you, he said, his voice breaking. I'm not leaving you. She reached up, her fingers brushing his cheek. You gave me hope, she said softly. More than I dreamed. As the distant sound of approaching drones grew louder, Ethan tightened his grip on her, determination blazing in his eyes. We'll find a way, he said. I won't give up. Not on you. And as the dawn broke over the forest, the bond they had forged, a bond of trust, sacrifice, and hope, shone brighter than ever. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would endure.